Let's go through the sort of inside of the papers. And Albie Amankona, political commentator and co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism, joins me. Albie, very good morning to you. This is, for you, presumably a bit exhausting. It's a not again, we're here, where people have got questions to ask of how much integrity the Conservatives really do have.
Good morning, Rosie. Well, it's certainly a difficult set of stories for the Conservative Party. I think many Conservatives were hoping that with Rishi Sunak at the helm after the very tumultuous short time that Liz Truss was in office and a little bit longer time that Boris Johnson was in office, that Rishi Sunak was going to come into office with integrity, with professionalism, with respect, and be this adult and grown up in the room. But he seems to be mired with similar scandals as we saw with Boris Johnson, of course. His appointment of Suella Braverman as the Home Secretary was controversial because, of course, she stood down because she broke the ministerial code. And then his appointment of Nadhim Zahawi as the party chairman and a minister without portfolio he may now be regretting as well, because now Nadhim Zahawi is in all of this hot water with regards to whether or not he has acted completely honestly when disclosing his taxes to HMRC.
Do you think he has?
Look, we don't know the ins and outs of the situation, and the Prime Minister has ordered the independent ethics advisor to look into the matter, and I think we'll have to reserve judgment until those conclusions have been made. We don't know the full story. That's part of the
problem, isn't it? We don't know the full story. It would be so much easier if we had the facts to hand. Then you wouldn't have to say, let's wait and see.
I always think sunlight is the best disinfectant. And, if Nadhim Zahawi were to come out and just be honest and talk about what had gone on, then perhaps that would look better than the rolling through of a parliamentary investigation like we saw with Partygate, only for something bad to happen to the person that was involved. Last time, Boris Johnson. In the end, I always think, it's better just to get this stuff out there. So perhaps, we might see Nadhim Zahawi make a further statement after the statement he made over the weekend about exactly what has gone on with this matter with HMRC. But it's certainly not a good look for the Conservative Party. And it's going to be a difficult week, or indeed weeks to come, for Nadhim Zahawi.
We're sort of playing ping pong, I think, with these statements. We hear a little bit, and then the next statement comes back with just a little bit more information. And then it was, I was being careless. But we'll see how that develops. Let's head to the front page of the Times, if we can, Albie. And this story, concern here in the Met Police and how they're hiring officers. Metropolitan Police recruits are being hired, so says the Times, without face-to-face interviews that test them on their motives and their values. And that has increased concern that some rogue candidates could slip through the net. It's been a really tough time for the Met to try and convince the public and the force at large to say, trust us to look after you.
It has been a very difficult time for the Met to tell the public to trust us, particularly women, when we've seen these awful cases, whether or not we're talking about the rape and murder of Sarah Everard by Wayne Couzens, these multiple sexual offences over, decades by PC David Carrick, which is the kind of the main story at the moment. Trust in the Met is at a real low. And I think what is almost quite shocking about it is maybe putting the recruitment process to one side. It's that it seems that there are these instances where there are Met police officers that misbehave, and then there's almost no penalty for it, or there's just a suspension, or they get moved to a different department. And it's just quite shocking that there can be police officers who commit crimes against members of the public and then just are shifted around with their different police forces. That seems quite shocking for me. But on this particular issue about the recruitment process, there's some suggestion that this could be as a result of the pledge to increase the numbers of police officers that are going to be on our streets, and maybe things are being done too quickly. Maybe some practices and COVID practices haven't been reverted back to normal, particularly when it comes to face-to-face interviews. So there's a number of different parts of this story.
I mean, the paper's suggesting here that what happened is in the pandemic, face-to-face interviews were cut, and not all forces have brought them back in. You would assume, though, in the process of hiring someone who is going to look after us, the public, that someone would speak to them face-to-face to say, let's get the mettle of this person before I give them the job.
You most certainly would. There's definitely an element to when you're talking to someone face to face, you're looking into the whites of their eyes. You can understand if they're honest person. There's a lot of body language cues that humans read from each other in these real life situations, which you just can't replicate down the line. I wish I was in the studio with you this morning, Rosie.
I wonder what you're getting at there, Albie. It would have been a pleasure to have you in here. Let's talk about the front page of the Daily Mail. And Boris Johnson's in Ukraine, and we can get on to the fact that maybe he's used this as a strategy in the past to deflect away from maybe what's going on more in his personal or financial life. But it is a really powerful weed. What the hell is the West waiting for, he says. He says, I'm standing over the graves of some of the 416 inhabitants of this town. He's in Butcher. 9 of them children who were shot by the Russians in an attempt to terrify the rest. I mean, it is an extraordinary account of what's going on there. He does, as former Prime Minister and with his relationship with Zelensky, have the ability to go and tell these stories. And the message he's making is very loud and clear and says the West need to give all the weapons it can to Ukraine. Do you think people will listen to him?
It's really an extraordinary intervention from Boris Johnson. I think most of the time when Boris Johnson has something to say, many people will be listening. I think this is really Boris Johnson trying to shore up his legacy and really try to remind people what he was good at rather than what he was bad at. And I think it's widely accepted that his response to Ukraine was world-leading, if not the best in the world. He's developed a very good personal relationship with President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine. He's basically saying, look, this whole hoo-ha that's going on in Europe about who's going to be sending tanks, we need to get over that as quickly as possible and get those tanks over to Ukraine to get this war over and done with. And that will ease some of the cost of living pressures that we're all facing at home in Britain. So really tying together some of the main problems that we are seeing in Europe at the moment, of course, the war in Ukraine being one of them, and the resultant inflation and cost of living crisis that has happened as a result of that.
And this is one sort of striking quote. He says, Ukraine, they're fighting for the principle that nations should not have their borders changed by force. When Ukraine wins, that is a message that will be heard around the world. How much of this is motivated by Boris Johnson's sort of personal image and, as you said, legacy? Or is this genuinely about him saying, act now and urgently?
Honestly, I think it's a bit of both. If we're thinking about who the main audience is in terms of the people who are maybe dragging their heels when it comes to sending tanks, it is without a doubt the Germans and Germany. And one would probably ask the question, how much is Olaf Scholz going to be listening to Boris Johnson? Probably not very much. So ultimately, if we're talking about the people that actually Boris Johnson's message needs to go out to, it might not be Daily Mail readers, it might be European leaders. So I think there's a bit of both. I think there's a bit of him wanting to shore up his personal legacy at home, but also this is someone that does still command authority on the international stage.
Let's look at the Telegraph if we can. And I mentioned this story going through the headlines, but it's absolutely astounding. This story, an Afghan double killer, I'm reading from the front page here, was able to sneak into Britain posing as a 14-year-old schoolboy before then going on to murder an aspiring Royal Marine. These are details that emerged over the day yesterday. The MP, Tobias Ellwood, called for an urgent inquiry into the failings in the case. I mean, that's an understatement for how catastrophically wrong this has gone.
I mean, this is an absolutely shocking story to basically hear that a refugee, an asylum seeker perhaps, has really gained the quite generous European asylum system in order to commit crimes against people in this country and actually, kill people in this case. And I think one of the things that was particularly shocking about the story, and it's also covered in the Daily Mail, is where his foster parents talk about how they were terrified of his obsession with knives, and they felt they had to lock up all of the knives in their house just to feel safe. And I think it really does call into question the checks that are in place when we do have people entering this country, either through the legal asylum seeker routes or illegally crossing the channel, or obviously the checks are more difficult, and whether or not the tests that we do at the moment are actually adequate, or if, as reported a couple of weeks ago, we do want to start doing, more dental checks directly upon arrival rather than waiting for the social services tests, which aren't all that accurate. In this case, they didn't get his age correctly.
Albie, thank you so much for talking us through the stories, making particularly the front pages this morning. Really appreciate your time.